above all to Peter. Professor Howie is one of the star professors in our school. He's been one of the founding members of our school. He's a regular presenter in our webinar series, and they will be talking to us about an assessment of Kazakhstan emission trading scheme. Peter, as usual, the format is always the same. You speak for 30, 35 minutes, so then we take a few questions from the floor, and the floor is yours now.
Right, thank you, Ricardo. Okay, I'll share my screen, and we have a PowerPoint presentation. Just let me know if things don't work out. Sometimes the slides don't turn, and sometimes there's bars on places, but hopefully not tonight. Okay, so the presentation I'm giving tonight is assessing Kazakhstan's emissions trading scheme outcomes, and it's based on two recent papers that I've published, one in 2000 and one earlier this year. So just an outline. So an overview of the presentation. I'm going to go fairly quickly. So I know I have 30 to 35 minutes, so I'm going fairly quickly through it. First of all, I'll just give you a brief outline on Kazakhstan's carbon profile to see it puts everything into context, I believe. Then also I'll do an introduction to low carbon development policies, because the ETS, the emissions trading schemes, is one component of low carbon development. And it's absolutely necessary to understand the other parts of low carbon development. So I'm putting the emissions trading into context. Then the third part is comparing Kazakhstan's emissions trading, or I'm just going to say it ETS throughout the presentation, the acronym. Comparing Kazakhstan's ETS to the EU's ETS. And this is from a paper that was just recently published this year. And the part 4 is comparing Kazakhstan's and Korea's ETSs. And this is a paper that was published 2 years ago. And then I'll finish off with just some general recommendations that come out of these two papers. So this just shows a graph of Kazakhstan's carbon profile. Now, first of all, I want you to look at the dashed line, because the dashed line is the carbon intensity with respect to GDP. And what you'll notice is that from 1990 to about 2013, Kazakhstan's carbon intensity dropped considerably. And just to put this into context, Kazakhstan's emissions trading system started in 2013. So if you look, if the policymakers were looking backwards, they're saying, wow, look, our economy is getting much less carbon intensive over time. We can take advantage of this, this trend. But what happens after 2014 is you'll notice that it starts coming, the intensity grows after that. So that's one component that we have to consider. The second component that we should consider as well is the CO2 emissions intensity in Kazakhstan's power sector. And what this shows is that since 1999, the carbon intensity of Kazakhstan's power sector has actually been growing. And more or less, Kazakhstan's economy took off starting in 2000. The Russian crisis in 1997, in 98, and then the very low oil prices in 1999, and then oil prices started to increase in 2000. And there's this, and Kazakhstan's economic development and its carbon intensity in the power sector are closely correlated. And this is an issue that we have to consider a lot. Okay, so that just puts the carbon profile into context. So let's go ahead and look at low carbon development. And I'm going to use a 3-pillar approach, and this originates from Nicholas Stern's climate sort of work. And then from Nicholas Stern, a person called Michael Grubb continued his research. And I'm going to concentrate on Michael Grubb's work. And Michael Grubb states that low carbon development there really needs to be three pillars. Pillar one deals with standards, labeling, and regulatory policy. Pillar two focuses on using markets and pricing. And pillar three focuses on innovation and building institutions. And so I'll just go through this fairly quickly. So the first pillar, again, pillar one looks at sort of standards and public engagement. And these are just, this is from GRUBB'S sort of work from 2014, a book that he did on planetary economics. And he just breaks this pillar into information tools. So this is kind of labeling and auditing, regulatory mechanisms, which means standards, building codes, and fiscal instruments such as gasoline and fuel tax and subsidies for capital subsidies to generate more fuel energy efficient either buildings or equipment. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar deals with putting a price on carbon. And what GRUBB'S says is that if you want to put prices on carbon, there's things that you have to consider. First of all, putting a price on carbon requires well-informed, rational economic agents in a well-functioning market who trust government. So there's a lot of preconditions for price to work. And from voters, for most voters, emissions reduction is a recognizable public good. And taxation is a much more pressing private bad. So people don't like taxation, but they understand that emissions reduction is a good. And what GRUBB'S says that the smart approach to pricing, and he's an advocate for emissions trading system over a carbon tax. He says that what you should do is you start with a quantity cap and trade, which is an emissions trading system. Increase the degrees of auctions over time, which means that you stop giving away free permission to pollute, carbon dioxide. And then once established, the economy doesn't fall over, doesn't complain too much and do what Australia did and revoke its emissions trading system. Then what you do is you introduce a price floor or a price corridor, or price floor or price ceiling through reserve auctions, along with a coherent account of tangible benefits, including how money from the auctions will be used. So everything has to be transparent. How the money from the auctions is used has to be transparent. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar deals with innovation. And what the research shows is that initial innovation must be government enhanced. It must be pushed by the government. Once innovation is far enough on the development path, then business takes over. So at the beginning of innovation, you have to have technology pushed by the government. And then further along in the development path, you can have market pull by the firms and the consumers. So the key thing here is that you need to have government intervention. It's absolutely essential if you're going to have an effective low carbon development path. So again, that's the third pillar. So what does this all say? Well, first of all, he's saying that energy efficient policy on its own is limited. And it's limited because of the scale of intervention. Pricing on its own is limited because of rising political resistance to rising fuel bills. And we all saw the potential impact of rising fuel bills in Kazakhstan in January. And also the issue of competitiveness. And this is something that's happening right now in the EU with these border agreement tariffs for carbon dioxide, so carbon taxes. And then also innovation on its own is limited by a lack of demand pull incentives by companies, as well as political failures and the absence of rising market feedbacks. So what GRUBB is saying is that if you want to pursue low carbon development, you have to actually do all three policies concurrently. And this is actually what the EU has been doing. And it's been shown that the synergy of these three pillars is quite substantial. So, the research shows that the EU policy has been, low carbon development has been quite effective. Now, I understand, the EU people are and firms are suffering at the moment because of gas supply, but let's not consider that issue at the moment. So we've gone through the first two components. Now let's look at comparing Kazakhstan's and EU's ETSs. So this is just a very, I'm not going to discuss this table very much. So all I'm going to do is this shows that there's been three phases in Kazakhstan. The first phase was in 2013. The second phase was 2014 and 2015, and phase 3 was 2018 to 2020. In general, the only greenhouse gas that's covered by the emissions trading system in Kazakhstan is carbon dioxide, and the covered sectors, or the sectors, the regulated sectors, are power, which includes electricity and heat, oil and gas, mining, metallurgical, chemical, and construction materials. And in general, for the first two phases, the allocation for the rights to pollute carbon dioxide was through grandfathering. In phase 3, there was a movement where each facility had the choice of choosing either benchmarking or grandfathering. Now let's look at the EU ETS. The EU ETS, its pilot phase was a 3-year phase. It was 2005 to 2007. Phase 2 was 2008 to 2012, and phase 3 was 2013 to 2020. In the pilot, only CO2 was covered, but after the pilot, then nitrous oxides and fluorocarbons were also covered. In the pilot phase, the regulated facilities were power, heat, and energy intensive industries. In phase 2, aviation was added, and phase 3, carbon capture and storage, petrochemicals, and non-ferrous and ferrous metals were added to it. Now, similar to the pilot in Kazakhstan, most of the carbon allocation in the EU was through grandfathering. And in phase 2, there was grandfathering and some benchmarking and a minor amount of auctioning of allowances. In phase 3, auctioning actually grew quite considerably, so that almost 2/3 of the allowances were auctioned in phase 3. And so that actually the firms actually had to pay. They had to actually pay for the rights to pollute carbon dioxide. So let's just look at the general impacts of the ETS. So first of all, just look at emissions levels of CO2. In the EU's CO2 emissions from electricity and heat sectors fell on an average of 1.1% per year over the 2005 and 2016 period. Now, I'm focusing on electricity and heat sectors both in the EU and Kazakhstan because they're the predominant emitters of carbon of the regulated firms. So in the EU, dropped about 1.1% per year. In Kazakhstan, the growth rate of CO2 emissions from the power sector decreased from an average of 5% growth per year from 2000 to 2012 to 2.3% per year from 2013 to 2017. So this could state something that, the ETS, Kazakhstan's ETS may have have an effect. But what we forget is that in 2014 to 2016, Kazakhstan experienced very low growth, GDP growth of 1.1 and I think 1.3% in 2014 and 2015. So one possible reason for this drop was because of the drop in GDP and economic activities. How about the carbon market? Well, this means like how many of these allowances were actually traded on the market. Well, in Kazakhstan, in phase 1 and phase 2, the activity was very thin. Only 0.8% and 1.3% of the total allocated emissions were traded. So this sort of shows what you want to do with the emissions is you want to, so the firms that actually do emissions, reduce their emissions, they can sell it elsewhere. So this is showing that there's no really good market development in carbon in Kazakhstan. And I'll put that into context in the EU. For the first 3 years of operation of the EU ETS or phase 1, almost 43% of the annual emissions cap were traded in the market. So it was quite a liquid market. How about carbon prices? Well, in phase 2 in Kazakhstan, in 2014, the average price of carbon in the market was just less than 80 cents. And in 2015, it was just over $2. And put that into context with the EU. In the EU, in phase 1, the average price was 10 euro, and in phase 2, just over 14 euro. So there's a considerable difference in the pricing of carbon. So when we looked at the EU ETS and Kazakhstan ETS, the methodology we used was we tried to identify transmission channels of which CO2 pricing could move into the economy and try to figure out what happened in these channels. So what we did is we developed this flow chart, and what you'll notice is that if there's a carbon price increase, the carbon prices can be passed on to the final consumers, and as it will result in less carbon because of the income and substitution effects. There'll be fuel substitution, so carbon intensive fuel will be substituted by less carbon intensive fuel. So for instance, coal will be substituted by gas. And then, so that's 2 ways. Another way, the industry, if they cannot pass on their prices, the increasing prices, or they can't substitute fuels, what they can do is they can look at investment either in energy efficiency or carbon efficiency, and both will reduce carbon intensity in the economy. Another approach is because carbon prices will increase, it may lead to renewable energy system penetration by itself. And that will reduce the carbon intensity of the economy. Now, the government support relies on revenues collected by auctions and fines. And these revenues can be plowed back either to pursue energy reduction policies or to promote low carbon energy options through subsidies. And again, that can reduce carbon intensity. So what we did is we developed this typology, and we assessed several of these with respect to Kazakhstan. Well, first of all, I should let you know that the Kazakhstan emissions trading prohibits cost pass on. So heat and electricity generators cannot pass on the carbon prices to the final consumers. Prices of heat and electricity are heavily regulated in Kazakhstan. So first of all, I'll kind of ignore that component. Second of all, fuel substitution. Yes, there has been some fuel substitution, but in general in Kazakhstan it's been minimal. But let's just go on and see what happened. So what about sort of energy pricing? I want to talk about energy pricing in Kazakhstan versus the EU. So with electricity, the average residential electricity tariff in 2019 was 3 US cents per kilowatt hour. And when you want to compare this to the EU, the residential electricity prices ranged from just over 11 cents in Bulgaria to just under 35 cents in Germany. And so that's for electricity. And for residential natural gas, in Kazakhstan, the tariff was 1.29 US dollars per gigajoule, while it ranged from 10.75 US dollars per gigajoule in Hungary to 36.8 US dollars per gigajoule in Sweden. So what you can see is that there are considerable differences in the prices of energy in these two jurisdictions. So let's look at what happened with electricity prices. So during 2005 to 2012, for instance, electricity prices in Germany increased by around 3% per year. Now, compare this to Kazakhstan, that during 2014 to 2018, real consumer prices, consumer and producer prices declined at 2.5% and 2.6% respectively. And in 2019, not only did real electricity prices decrease, they even fell in nominal terms. So, as a result, there was increases in prices of electricity in the EU, and actually decreases in prices of electricity in Kazakhstan during the ETS. As I said before, in Kazakhstan, there was very little change in the fuel mix and power generation. But in the EU, there was quite considerable change in the fuel mix. In phase one, there was a movement from brown coal or lignite coal to more efficient bituminous or hard coal. And in phase two, there was a movement from coal to natural gas. So that channel worked in the EU, but it didn't really work that well in Kazakhstan. How about investment? Well, in Kazakhstan, growth rates of the power sector investment declined from an annual average of 13% during 2007 to 2014 to -7% in 2015 to 2018. How does this compare to the EU? Well, the best I could do is to find some work by Kalo, and I'm not even going to try to say the other person's name, but they showed that there was actually an increase in low carbon patenting activities for EU ETS regulated firms when compared to non-regulated firms. So there was some incentives for the regulated firms to pursue low carbon patenting activities. So there was some investment in the power sector in the EU. So that sort of ends the discussion, the comparison of Kazakhstan and Korea's ETS, and I'll just summarize it after the EU. Now we'll go to the Korea and Kazakhstan's ETS. So again, this is just the same slide I had before, but we'll look at Korea's ETS. And what you'll notice is that at the Korea there's 3 phases. I'm sorry, but the phase 3 is not right. That's a mistake. Just ignore phase 3, the dates on that. It started in 2021, but we'll just look at phase 1 and phase 2. So the Korean ETS covers a lot of different greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, fluorocarbons, and others. In the methods of allocation were in general, started off in phase 1 with grandfathering. It moved to more grandfathering and benchmarking in phase 2, and in phase 3, it's moving towards more and more auctioning. So there's some similarities between the three. So the methodology that we use to analyze the Korean emissions and Kazakhstan emissions is we looked at ICAP and PMR's criteria for effective ETS design. And what we did is we tried to assess how these designs, these criteria map into the policy success typology. And on top of that, what we did is we operationalized these 9 criteria and analyzed each of the Korean ETS and the Kazakh ETS with respect to the 9 criteria. So just the dimensions of policy success that we looked at, there's 6 dimensions. We looked at process, program, political, distributional, temporal, and capacity. Process more or less it focuses on the process of actually how the policy was implemented. Program, did it actually achieve the intended outcomes? Political is, how much of a political success the policies were. Distributional is the effects on different subpopulations. Temporal means that these are major policy changes. So they may not be that effective at the beginning of their lives, but they could become much more and more effective over their life cycle, life term. And capacity just specifically looks at the level of human capacity to actually manage and have an effective ETS system. So what we did is then what we have is we used the PMR and ICAP's success dimensions, and these would be there's 9 of these: contribution to mitigation, cost effectiveness of mitigation, predictability, policy flexibility, accountability and transparency, administrative cost effectiveness, appropriateness to local conditions, compatibility with other jurisdictions, and fairness. Now I'm just going to go back to the first one in this one. And so what we did is we actually developed our own indicators for each of the success dimensions, because ICAP and PMR is a part of the World Bank system. They just sort of defined the concept, but never tried to operationalize the concept. So one of our contributions was actually operationalizing the concepts of each of contribution to mitigation, cost effectiveness of mitigation, etc. So we developed all these indicators. And then what I told you before, what we tried to do is we mapped PMR and ICAP's criteria with the policy success dimensions here, and this is what we did. And so we just took each concept and determined how the Kazakhstan ETS did with respect to the indicators and how Kazakhstan did with respect to each of the indicators. And here's an example. I don't want to go through each one individually. We did it for cost effectiveness. We did it for predictability, policy flexibility, accountability and transparency, administrative cost effectiveness, appropriateness to local conditions, compatibility with other jurisdictions, fairness. And so we did all this, and we came up with our overall assessment and said, okay, how well has each of these ETSs done with respect to ETS success criteria and the policy success dimension. So here what you'll notice is that in general, Kazakhstan has done poorly with respect to program, process, and political and capacity dimensions. And it's done medium well on distributional issues. In comparison, the Korean ETS has done remarkably well on 3 dimensions. It's done well on temporal, political, and process and capacity. And it's done acceptably on program and distributional issues. So what we tried to do is we said, okay, what can Kazakhstan learn from Korea's experience? Both Kazakhstan and Korea are emerging economies. They're defined in the literature as emerging economies. So what can Kazakhstan learn from Korea? So these are some of the policy recommendations that we came through, and I've combined some of these policy recommendations with the recommendations from comparing the EU ETS and Kazakhstan's ETS. Well, first of all, you have stakeholder engagement and communication in policy development, implementation, and assessment are critical. You have to have it. If you don't, it's not going to be an effective policy. The development of homegrown capacity within the public sector, business, and civil society organizations is absolutely essential as well. Developing and emerging economies need to implement policies that are complementary to standard ETS systems to address the issue of energy price regulations and possible escalations because of carbon costs and corresponding social unrest and political instability. So you really have to consider the other 2 components that GRUBB talks about in low carbon growth. Prohibit over-the-counter trading of emissions allowances to promote both liquidity and efficient price discovery. An essential component of an emissions trading system is a liquid carbon market. If allowances are allocated by benchmarking, then establish a set of benchmarks that are based on emissions of the most carbon efficient firms or set according to best available technologies, therefore incentivizing CO2 efficiency investments as well as fuel substitution. Implement an allowance auction system that enables recycling of revenues to finance renewable energy systems and demand side policies as well as increased public support. And enable some form of pass-through of costs of compliance to final consumers to enable firms to upgrade or replace outdated technology, as well as to promote energy savings and efficiency in the wider economy. If past cost through is politically unacceptable, consider implementing indirect emissions regulations for large electricity and heat consumers, similar to what is being done in Korea. And finally, implement some energy subsidy reform. Energy subsidies have to be removed. It's a long-term process, but it has to be done. You're seeing the impacts of energy subsidies in Kazakhstan with respect to problems in the electricity grid earlier this year and in last week. I have a feeling the issue at the, was it Pavlodar? One of the chimneys in Pavlodar combined heat and power plant broke last week, and I have a feeling a lot of the equipment in Kazakhstan is technologically outdated and needs to be replaced, and it's not being replaced because of energy subsidies. So just some end notes. A successfully designed and implemented ETS has the ability to significantly reduce carbon emissions from the business as usual case by facilitating greater economic efficiency and productivity. Governments seem to understand that modifications to the design of the textbook ETS must be made to adjust to social values and interests in order to get better outcomes for the country as a whole. And finally, implementing an ETS requires learning and buy-in by all actors, and rushing the launch of an ETS has shown to lead to policy failure in obtaining effective carbon reductions, postponement, or abandonment. Abandonment had happened in Australia. Postponement had happened in Kazakhstan, where the ETS was postponed. The third phase of Kazakhstan's ETS was postponed by just under 2 years. So this ends the presentation. So I'll stop sharing. And I'm a little bit ahead of time. So we have quite a bit of time for me to take your questions. And I'm willing to take any that you're willing to field